the public language, even from Israel's strongest supporters, is getting more sharp and putting Israel on notice that they cannot do in the south of Gaza what they have done in the north. Certainly of the United Kingdom government, the Americans, Canadians, and Germans at least, that support is still very strong for Israel. But there is a very different public tone now. It's true when Rishi Sunak says that he's been making these points since the start. He has, but in private to Netanyahu. He's now making them very public. And we're seeing the same thing from Antony Blinken and President Biden. So I think the public language, even from Israel's strongest supporters, is getting more sharp and putting Israel on notice that they cannot do in the south of Gaza what they have done in the north.
I guess the response from some elements in Israel itself has been, well, wait a minute, this is a war. We are a country at war. We had our sovereign border breached. We had our civilians attacked. The number that were killed on October the 7th, if you take it proportionally as a proportion of our population, is many times what happened on 9/11 in the States. And we weren't putting restrictions on America on what they could do to defend themselves after that. So why are we different? And I guess that articulation has not actually been made by some of the leaders and defence ministers and secretaries of state in these G7 nations that you've mentioned.
Well, all that is true, Ruth, but the problem is for Israel is that they've set themselves very high objectives right at the start of this to eliminate Hamas completely as a military threat to Israel, which might be achievable, to make sure that Hamas has no governance role in the future of Gaza, which is maybe partly achievable, and also to eliminate Hamas as a sort of political organization, which I don't think is achievable, not least because a lot of Hamas leaders actually live outside Israel and Gaza. So they've set this bar very high, and the Israeli military, are obviously determined to carry out those objectives as best they can, but doing so in a very small physical area when there are 2.2 million civilians living there is bound to lead to very heavy civilian casualties and a great deal of humanitarian distress. And that's what we're seeing every day on our TV screens, and it's that to which even Israel's strongest allies are having to respond. And of course, many of those who supported Israel following the atrocities on the 7th of October, like other Europeans, are beginning to be a lot more muted in their support for Israel now.
And presumably a lot of that is about, yes, while we will absolutely publicly state that you have a right to go after Hamas, the fallout for the civilian Palestinian population who are not Hamas, they are a different entity to Hamas. Hamas is a political and military, paramilitary and terrorist organization, which is separate to the population of Gaza, requires a separation of response.
Yes, and so far, 15,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza, of whom about 6,000 are children. So, this is really quite a high collateral damage rate. And of course, you're absolutely right to emphasize that Israel has a complete international right to defend itself and to deter future threats. And therefore, bombing the enemy, as it were, is entirely legitimate tactic. But it's clear that the extent of the civilian casualties has been quite shocking to many Western leaders, and that's what they're responding to. And given that a lot of the population has already been pushed into the south, to start military operations in the south is almost certain to lead to a great number of civilian casualties in the coming weeks.
Well, if you've been following kind of the diplomatic efforts that have been happening around all of this, obviously we've heard a lot from the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, including again this week. We've heard a lot from Qatar, that seems to be leading the discussions regarding hostage transfer and return, and also the ceasefire that's just ended. Should we be hearing more about Britain, should we be stepping up our efforts, particularly given the history here and even, in terms of our responsibility of the very fact of the establishment of a Jewish state?
Well, yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have a checkered past in the region, and arguably we were responsible for the establishment of the Jewish state in 1948 following the Balfour Declaration, and therefore we do have a responsibility to be involved. I think where Britain can play a major role, though, as opposed to a sort of part role in humanitarian relief and sort of helping with the negotiations on hostages, which is very much a subsidiary role, is on the day after discussions, because so far Benjamin Netanyahu has been very reluctant to talk about what happens the day after the military campaign ends, both in terms of who runs Gaza, but also how do you transition from the crisis that we're in now to the potential settlement of the Palestinian question in a way which can secure Israel's security for the long term. Because one thing is clear, that as long as that Palestinian issue remains, whatever happens to Hamas, the security of Israel will never be 100% secure. So something has to change in the future. And that's where I think British sort of intellectual inputs and creativity on the policy thinking can play a significant role.